Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, our series of panel discussions today will pick up on themes and issues raised by Yang Berhormat Nik Nazmi and Datuk Charon in their speeches earlier. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, let's get started with our first panel. In order to avert the worst consequences of climate change, Malaysia targets to achieve net zero carbon emissions earliest by 2050, and this cannot be reached without the buy-in of the corporate sector. But what best motivates businesses to adopt ambitious climate change targets and, more importantly, put their money where their mouth is? Our first panel of the day will explore these very issues. I'm pleased to invite to the stage Datuk Amran Hafiz Affifudin, Executive Director of Khazanah Nasional, Mr. Philip C., Group Chief Sustainability Officer at Malaysia Aviation Group, and Mr. Yin Shao Loong, Senior Research Associate at Khazanah Research Institute. Encik Ahmad Farouk Muhammad, Executive Vice President at MIDF, will moderate this discussion. For those who wish to submit your questions via slido.com, the code for the session is CLIMATE. You can also scan the QR code on screen. Farouk, gentlemen, over to you.
Thank you, Khazanah. So, good morning, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this first panel of the day, and where we'll be touching on the topic of what drives corporate promises on climate change. I think we've heard already YB Nik Nazmi speaking this morning, and definitely there's a lot of responsibility on our collective shoulders. I think we have gathered in the hall here today representations from all of corporate Malaysia, SMEs, and also our SME clients, and also from the larger corporates that our investment bank is talking to. So, but let me quickly introduce the distinguished panel that I have with me here. But first of all, I have to apologize that we are not meeting ESG standards in terms of gender representation. But at least we have a nice mix of the handsome and the less handsome. But I won't point out which one's which. But so, quickly now, by way of quick introduction, next to me is Datuk Amran Hafiz Affifudin, Executive Director of Khazanah, and also holds the head of Malaysian Investments. His long experience in overseeing private equity and also private and public equity in Khazanah, and before that, I think makes him well positioned to talk about how companies are dealing with the sustainability issues in Malaysia. And of course, next to him is Philip C., Chief Group Sustainability Officer at Malaysia Airlines Group. I've got that right. But prior to this, I mean, this is a recent appointment, right, Philip? Right? Prior to this, he was CEO of Firefly, and of course, which you know is our community airline, which is something like, if you can imagine, Spider-Man before the multiverse, and that's Philip C. And bringing up the rear, we have Yin Shao Loong, Senior Research Associate from Khazanah Research Institute. We've deliberately picked him for this panel, even though he doesn't know about it, because we want him to counter everything that the two gentlemen are saying. So I hope you don't mind, Philip. And so to kick things off, let me just get Datuk Amran to say a few words about what Khazanah is doing in sustainability and climate change.
Thank you, Farouk. Assalamualaikum and good morning. I mean, thank you again, MIDF, for inviting us to be on the panel and for the conference. It's indeed an honor. I think what Khazanah is doing is, I guess, twofold. First, at the enterprise level, at Khazanah level. As you know, we are no more than 500 people strong organization. We're a small company, investment holding. So, but we have certain targets that we are actually on a positive trajectory to achieve. So, for example, our carbon neutral operation by 2023, we are in the last stages of measuring our carbon emission at Khazanah level. And we are covering Scope 1, Scope 2, and partial Scope 3. But also part of the project is also determining strategies available to us before we talk about the offset options. So that's at Khazanah. In terms of diversity, equity and inclusion, we have policies in place already. We have a unit on DEI. We have started with a level of awareness or an increased level of awareness in our organization. And we have also reflected this emphasis on DEI in our voting guidelines, whereby we will be, by 2025, we will be voting against chairmen of NRCs that do not, are not able to achieve the 30% guideline for gender representation. Farouk, you might remember when you were in Khazanah, we had started efforts in terms of quantifying the impact of our investment. So we've continued that. Name change a bit, now we're calling it Semara. It's actually our own impact assessment framework, and it's tied primarily to our 6 billion Dana impact. So we realized that when we do impact investment, financial return may not be as high as we usually used to, but how do we quantify the returns, quote unquote, from the impact that we make? So that's ongoing, and it's very challenging, but I think we've have positive stride on that basis. And of course, which I can talk in, goes into the more important part, which is our portfolio. We have constituted ESG KPIs in all our companies and pushed to for all the board and also CEOs and senior management to have ESG KPIs, of course via our representation at the board and also via our votes at the AGMs and EGMs. So again, in a way, at Khazanah level, we're on a positive trajectory. But more importantly, I can also talk about it later. More importantly, we are already trying to be very active on the portfolio side, which has more impact to the country.
So, I mean, it's the message seems to be clear that, I mean, to the extent that you are going to vote against NRC chairmen who do not put 30% ladies on the board, right? So it is serious, it is important. But why do you see that sustainability practices at the portfolio companies is important to you as a shareholder?
Okay. Well, I think first of all, doing all these sustainability practices is an attempt to do good, right? So always good to do good. No, there's no evil corporation like that out there. Maybe there are, but no, probably, hopefully not in our portfolio.
And none here. None
I don't
here.
know. Hopefully not. I don't think so. But more importantly, it strikes to what all investors want, which is return, right? And we can take it. Let's look at it from top to bottom. First of all, the valuations, right? We've seen evidences of better multiples given to companies who are on a journey or made announcements towards climate change or sustainability practices or on the journey. I think the MSCI World Climate Index have shown a little bit of a premium, at least, but there is a premium nonetheless on companies that do have these practices in place. And most importantly, the earnings per share. End of the day, you got to look at the earnings per share, right? We can look at it from the point of view of, I think Minister also mentioned, and I think Datuk Sharon, opportunities and the risk, right? On the opportunity side, let's look at the revenue side, right? Sustainable practices is not only compliance, right? It's not only trying to adhere to certain rules. It also opens up opportunities to invest in new areas, which some of our companies are doing right now. And then on the cost side, on the operation side, on the finance cost side, for example, we know there are many banks who've spoken to us and also our portfolio companies and said, you know what, in 5 years, I can't touch you because you have exposure to coal, for example. So, and in the meantime, the cost of financing have gone up. So this goes straight to the heart of any enterprise, which is the returns, right? And it's reflected in the EPS and also the multiple that's given. So I think that's why it's very important. It's not just doing good, which absolutely, it's not just trying to comply with policies, with standards, with guidelines, absolutely, but it's also fundamental to the survival of the companies. That's what we see.
Okay, thanks, Dato'. I think we'll pick up on this point of good versus evil companies shortly. But maybe if you can now turn to Philip. Philip, why don't you just tell us a little bit about Malaysia Airlines Group and your sustainability blueprint?
Yeah, thanks. We are relatively new in our journey in sustainability. We launched our action plan about 2 years ago. I think many people thought we were crazy because it was in the midst of the pandemic. And at the time, focus was on business sustainability, just trying to show up our own balance sheet and our own businesses, as opposed to even thinking about this 10, 15-year problem that we were facing. So, for us in the airline, we are part of a global fraternity called IATA, an international aviation body. So it felt a bit like a checkbox for us to do sustainability then. But honestly, it really hit home very close to us when, in December 2021, you saw those floods hitting our operations, and you saw our staff affected, you saw our passengers affected, you saw the terminal operations affected. And if you actually do the proper modeling, you will see the runway, submerged 1/3 of the time by 2030. So it really has significant impact on our theater operations. You were saying just now, I used to manage Firefly, the business, and for some of you who have taken the turboprop operations to Seletar, if you ask every pilot here, they will tell you climate patterns have changed fundamentally. And I had a relatively easy time managing operations, but my successor has had a terrible time trying to manage disruptions on the business, right, due to climate change. So you talk to pilots, you talk to cabin crew, you talk to engineers who look at our engines, you look to our corporate finance team that talks to international banks. It's affecting our operations fundamentally. So while we started off 2 years ago as a pure checkbox, it's become very serious for us because it's really fundamentally impacting our business. So when we first started and thought, okay, environmental sustainability isn't congruent with business sustainability, the reality is that they're interconnected for us.
So a lot of these things that you're doing, I mean, of course, I suppose the primary initiative would be on reducing fuel consumption, besides, of course, communities and for the staff welfare and so on. So is that right?
So just to frame it for the aviation group as a whole, I mean, sustainability is very broad, right? We do things like human trafficking, wildlife trafficking, women underrepresentation in areas like pilots and engineers. And we're just talking about gender diversity. If you fundamentally change things like that, you actually fundamentally change the culture of the organization for the better, and you create diversity of thought as well. So those are a lot of the S and G. And, being proud of being part of Khazanah, the G part has been emphasized, way before this whole ESG conversation took place. On the E side, emissions is a subset of environment, and so we have issues on waste, in-flight waste, general waste. Across the board, those are huge challenges that we face with. But if you deep dive on the emission side for the airline, there are really 4 core levers to really try and reduce our emissions. The first lever is really operational efficiency. How do you basically work with air traffic control and basically improve efficiency? The second lever is to transition to better technology, which is fundamentally moving to more fuel-efficient aircraft, which is what's happening with the new replacements of our A330s and 737s. The third and most important lever is actually transitioning to biofuels, which is sustainable aviation fuels. And that's what we did 2 weeks ago, where we signed an agreement with Petronas to begin supplying sustainable aviation fuel from 2027 onwards. But even with these 3 efforts in place, in our internal modeling, that's even not enough to get us to net zero. So we even have to do out-of-sector efforts like carbon markets and carbon credits to deal with. So just to give you a frame of how we think about it from a sustainability standpoint, and how emissions is a subset of the overall environmental component for us.
I mean, interesting you're saying that, all of the efforts that you're making is still not enough to get down to net zero, but that's because of the industry that you're in, I presume.
It's a hard-to-abate sector. I mean, that's one of the biggest challenges we have, right? At the moment, aviation accounts for 2% of total emission. At the rate of doing nothing, by 2050, it'll account for 20%. Because aviation, like cement, is the same challenges, right? And so even if you pump the whole sustainable aviation fuel of our planes, the carbon content is still 10-15%, right? Even if you basically replace our whole carbon-based fuels with sustainable aviation fuels. So it is a fundamental challenge, but that shouldn't be the basis of not doing anything.
Then taking a phrase from Datuk Amran, do you consider yourself in the bigger picture a good company or an evil company? MAG. Sorry, you're not on the record, of course.
For sure, we are a force for good. I mean, I think, maybe just build this point, and I think Dato' Charon was saying just now, right, about this whole call not to fly. And, you know, there's this whole theme about Greta Thunberg in Europe, right, saying let's do flag scam, which is don't fly. And I think it's so important that we want this next younger generation to actually think about these issues. And I do a side job, which is I'm a Sunday school teacher on Sunday. And I teach 15, 16-year-old kids. And it's easy to talk to them about Pope Francis's encyclical of climate change as opposed to telling them about church scripture and tradition. They are more interested in these social issues than about church traditions. So really props to really this next generation to drive change. The challenge in Asia is that we are an archipelago. So really air connectivity is essential. It's really a critical economic enabler. It's not a luxury, unlike Europe, where you have alternative ground transport and land. And so, while there are some pockets of opportunity to basically also transition to alternative land transport, you really have to get the real infrastructure working from the airports to all the other parts. So, I'm very clear on our side, the aviation industry is a force for good because we provide connectivity.
It's true. I think these are some of the trade-offs that we need to think about, and hopefully we'll explore more of this as we dive further into this panel. But so maybe I can go now to Shao Loong, and who in Khazanah Research Institute he focuses on industrial policy and climate change. So I think again maybe if you can give your views on this topic, and later we'll get into a discussion within the panelists. Shao Loong, please.
Thank you. I'm going to talk about both industrial policy and climate change, actually. And thanks to MIDF for inviting me here. So I'm going to put a different spin on things that you might used to be hearing. So we all know that ESG sets out to do good, right? The G bit, you want good corporate governance, you want to fight against corruption, you want to prevent money laundering. The S bit, we have to oppose things like human trafficking, forced labor, modern slavery. That's all good, and we should be doing it. Now, there's a problem with E bit. Even though ESG sets out to do good, with the way that E is going right now, it risks committing a form of injustice, and that's particularly in terms of climate. How? I'll tell you why. Okay? There are two ways. First is that ESG as a whole gets narrowed to E, and then the E bit gets narrowed to C, climate. But there's more to environment than just climate. Right? Whether your company pumps in toxic waste into Sungai Kim Kim and the kids in the nearby school pass out due to the toxic fumes, or you're one of those irresponsible companies that dumps sewage and other toxic waste into directly into the rivers that causes the water shutdowns in Selangor and other neighboring states, that is pure corporate evil, right? And that shouldn't be done, and it should be punished severely under the law. But then climate's a bit different. You see, although we're being told that there's one kind of big climate agenda for the whole world, but the climate agenda is actually split, and there's a reason for that. Because what causes climate change? We know greenhouse gases cause climate change, and CO2, carbon dioxide, is the main gas that causes climate change. But there's a science to this. CO2 persists in the atmosphere for hundreds to thousands of years, and every country has contributed a different amount to how much CO2 there is in the air. What is the data? Malaysia's historical responsibility for global emissions for CO2 is only 0.4%. Okay? 0.4%. Right? It's ticking up as we go, but it's still well below 1%. The US is responsible for over 25% of emissions. 25% of global emissions. Just 6 countries are responsible for over 50% of global emissions. 6 countries, the US, the EU, Russia, we can include China there, the UK, and Japan. Malaysia is not one of those. Right? Most of the world is not one of those 6 countries. We're basically more vulnerable to climate change than we are responsible. And we're well within our fair share of the use of the atmosphere which Phillips planes fly in at the moment. But that's not well understood. But it's very important to understand the science. It's also very important to understand the Paris Agreement on climate change, because it upholds this sense of what they call common but differentiated responsibilities. Common, yes, we're all in it together. We have one planet, humanity is on here. We live or die together. At the same time, we live or die under different circumstances. And we live and die with different histories. So developed countries, those who started the Industrial Revolution back in the 1750s, they're mainly responsible for climate change. And they're supposed to take the lead in terms of climate action. The rest of us have a right to pursue socioeconomic development, to alleviate poverty, as well as try and find a more sustainable pathway forward, right? Which we're trying to do. But the issue is about not getting forced onto that kind of pathway or to somebody else's determination of what is a sustainable pathway that is beyond your economic means and beyond your own national social determination of what is just, right? We can have a conversation about it, and it's very important to have a conversation about it rather than dictated to or having your funds pulled back, right, or your credit lines withdrawn, as sometimes is happening now. So basically, climate change appears to be an environmental problem, but fundamentally it's an economic one because it rests on the kind of fuels that are burnt to power industrialization. And what do developing countries want to do? We want to industrialize. We want to be wealthy just like the rich countries, but maybe not in the same way, right? Step a little bit more lightly on the planet. At the same time, the kind of measures that developed countries use to climb the ladder of industrialization, trade protectionism, subsidies, infant industry protection, and so forth. All those things have been outlawed under the WTO and regional free trade agreements like the CPTPP and so forth, and we signed up to them because we felt we need to maintain our trade links and act nicely, okay? Except what's happening now in the US with the Inflation Reduction Act? Massive subsidies, right? What's happening in the EU with the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism? Trade protectionism, right? They're turning back the clock, but then they're telling us to stick to no subsidies, keep our borders open, right? Is it fair? Is it reasonable? Maybe not. So we want to get industrial advantages, right? But now the whole game is about shifting energy from burning fossil fuels to deriving energy from metals, basically, right? It's a metals game. We can see people in a big global rush for metals. But the ESG activism we're seeing from London, Frankfurt, New York, and so forth is based on expecting firms in Malaysia and other developing countries to meet the same standards and practices as the firms over there, right? Petronas is our national oil company. It's fundamentally a different kind of oil firm to Shell and Exxon, which are private firms. They have no development mandate. Petronas has a development mandate. They support 20% of our national budget, right? You can't say the same for Exxon and Shell, no matter how much you have a conspiracy theory about whether they control their respective governments or not, okay? Very different mandate. At the same time, of course, we're tied up in GVCs, focused on the US, right? And so we may have to jump to their tune, but at the same time, the US is cutting off GVC linkages with the rest of the world because under the Inflation Reduction Act, it's all about domestic production, right? We can't even get access to, say, the electric vehicle supply chain because we don't have one of the special deals there. So what can we do about this? Well, you can try and educate the 28-year-old fund manager in Frankfurt, New York, or London about the Paris Agreement and its finer points and that you have different strokes for different folks. At the same time, you can also look to diversify your funding sources, right? Developing countries are now rising. There's a BRICS bank that's growing and growing and growing. Maybe that'll lead to some interesting measures, maybe not. But they're going to understand our domestic situation a lot better than people in the West will. What else must we do? We have to be clear on our rights, our responsibilities, and our narrative, but don't expect fairness. We also all have to make the argument that corporate climate action, just like Philip pointed out, he may be from a hard-to-abate sector, but he's also from a climate-vulnerable firm, right? You got hit by floods. Your operations were stalled. Your staff were badly affected, right? So addressing physical risk is a very legitimate form of climate action by firms, not just measuring your Scope 1, your Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions like Frankfurt wants you to do. So it's important to carve out the space and to remind people that, yes, we're all in together for climate change, but we have all of us have taken a different historical path here, and that different historical path brings with it different rights and different responsibilities. Until we understand these kind of issues and we can articulate them both within ourselves domestically, because not all our regulators understand this, right? as well as internationally, you're going to be on the defensive when it comes to climate issues. You're just going to be taking orders from elsewhere. So it's important for you to determine what your stance is and, in a way, set out your borders fairly and effectively. Thanks.
Wow, Shao Loong. I mean, that's certainly saying something. And, you know, I think this is possibly the right audience, with the exception of maybe also YB Nick, hopefully. Yeah, I said, but this is really the right audience to be listening to that. But so just to follow up on that point very quickly. I mean, so it seems to be a continuation of the, you know, a Western domination agenda, you know, whatever that they have imposed on the rest of the world, right? So how do we fight back? I mean, as corporates here, how do we push back?
Malaysia's in a tricky position, right? We are very much embedded in, as I said, global value chains concentrated on the US. We're also connected to China. But in a way, that's only because China was connected to the US, right? We're part of the triangular trade between those two countries. And the US right now, and I won't say even right now, for the last few years, even Trump and before then to Obama, has been trying to disconnect from China, right? They realize that China's catching up. They utilize the great manufacturing capacity, the cheap labor, but the Chinese didn't just make cheap products for the Americans. They learned how to make cheap products and more effective technological products for themselves as well. And so they're catching up. They're scared about it, right? They did in a way, what we wanted to do. We wanted to industrialize. They industrialized successfully. Now they're getting cut off, right? We're not a very powerful country. We're not a very big country, but we need to make some very, very strategic decisions now about how we play between these two big powers. Are there opportunities for us to take advantage of what the US is doing in terms of their industrial policy? Can we participate in it and not get left behind? What is going to happen with China? If China's going to get disconnected from the US, what does that mean for our trade with China that's also dependent on the US? Right? So maybe we have to think about other customers as well in other parts of the world.
Yeah, so definitely, as you said, diversifying our financing sources, diversifying our customer base as well. So some points to look out for. But, I mean, and I have still with me a list of things that I want to ask the panelists, but maybe I'm going to give precedence to the audience here. So, of course, we have some mics floating around. If you wish to make a point of comment, just raise your hand and, you know, you'll get a mic sent to you very quickly. We also have a Slido facility, as you can see. Some questions, which you can't see, we can see here. Some questions have already come in. I just want to remind everyone, I mean, the code for Slido is climate. For this, there's a code for this particular session. Do look at the questions which are already up there. Give your likes or dislikes to those questions that will help it rise up in the list. And also another tip, if you do put your name on it, then they will help the question to be addressed. So the first one, maybe I put this to Datuk Amran here. What are the examples of KPIs that have been set for companies of which Khazanah is a shareholder, and especially KPIs relating to climate change? And I think this relates to a point that, you know, how active do you see? I mean, of course, we know Khazanah positions itself as an active shareholder, but how active are you on climate change? Are there voting decisions, examples of voting decisions that you have made with regards to climate-related issues?
Thank you, Farouk, and thank you for the question. I think I'll touch a bit on the KPI. I mentioned earlier on the more of the G side of ESG, right? For climate change, I think there are, depending on the companies, there are KPIs that pertains to decarbonization efforts, pertain to lowering of emission. I don't want to go into specific KPIs. I rather, if I may, talk to you about what are we doing vis-a-vis our portfolio companies, right? And how we handle climate change. Actually, what we have to understand is that there are two parts of Khazanah, right? One is that when we invest globally, we will stay away from non-ESG compliant potential investments. So we have a criteria. We probably have a bit of a negative list, of which we have already had even before ESG was a big mega trend. We stay away from gambling, we stay away from questionable businesses, etc., etc. So that's on investing globally. When we talk about our large holdings in Malaysia, this is where actually my portfolio caters to. We take a very active approach, right? We see it as there is no option of walking away. We see it as how we help the government and align the companies that we have substantial shares in to align ourselves with the goal, number one, the national goal, and also with Khazanah's own, which is actually aligned to the national goal. So, I mean, just take, for example, TNB, Tenaga. I mean, Datuk Sharon also mentioned in his context just now, Mas Philip can probably talk about it, but Tenaga, right? And there's another panelist later on Tenaga, so perhaps you can also ask him some questions. But from a shareholder level, we realize that we are still about 50-60% coal based, right? The problem now is coal, right? And this is Malaysia, and Tenaga obviously carries a large share of that, right? But to Shao Loong's point, right, and underlying his point just now is we always think about the unintended consequences, right? People in the energy industry, if YB Nick was here, they always talk about trilemma, about sustainability, affordability, security, right? At Khazanah, we see, and you all know that prices of coal have gone up substantially. Now it's come down a bit, but we see it more of not only an issue of affordability, definitely security, but we always talk about security in the security of the stability of supply. But we see the danger of coal as also a national security issue. We all import 100% of our coal. I think early last year in February, there was a threat by the Indonesian government not to export coal, ban on export. It raised panic because our stock can probably carry us for a couple of months. So that underlies the need for us to move away from coal. And Khazanah is very big on this. And we have communicated through the proper channel via our role as a shareholder, via our role as board members, and our engagement with the management on the need to move away from coal, expedite the energy transition. Having said that, I agree with Shao Loong, and it is also a Khazanah view that we don't dance to the tune of others. There must be a balance. We need to think about what is the impact on tariff, how is the government, what will be the unintended consequences of this move, which leads to another big word, which is just transition, right? Maybe we can talk about that later. But this is how Khazanah tackle our companies, and there are many other companies, airports, etc. But I use the Tenaga, it's quite glaring how we are dealing with being an active investor with regards to climate change.
Okay, thanks, Datuk. Definitely quite a few points I want to follow up on that. But let me just again move on to the next question, which is for Philip. So some people say that practicing ESG is an expensive affair for businesses, and I think a lot of the SMEs in the audience today can relate to that. So we know ESG is a cost, but so for MAG, how much pressure does this put on your margins, which we know is already thin to begin with?
I mean, it's incredible. I mean, if you think about our transition to sustainable aviation fuels, SAF is about 3 times the price of a classic hydrocarbon price. So, in addition to the long-term targets, we as an industry also have made a target of 10% sustainable aviation fuel by 2030. Now, what does that translate in terms of cost, right? If fuel is 1/3 of our cost structure, with a 3 times premium to that, you're adding additional 10% to the additional cost. And that's a big problem, right? Because margins are really for the aviation industry as a whole don't even cover your cost of capital. And that is the fundamental challenge. And so the debate here really is, where do you pass the cost to? Do you pass it to the consumer, right? Or do you basically absorb it? And then the question, and if you absorb it, where are you going to find efficiencies elsewhere in the organization to basically negate that? That's also the fundamental issue. But back to Shao Loong's point, right? The aviation industry is a global industry, and you actually see this big tussle in the world about what is the best way to manage this. As you see, the US has this whole incentive-driven Inflation Reduction Act. The Europeans are thinking about mandates, and that's also the same thing being played out for the sustainable aviation fuel industry, right? So this whole distinction is actually creating a lot of problems within the global industry in terms of what you do. So what do we do here in Asia, right? When you see that actually the West is divided in terms of how you approach decarbonizing a subsector which is global in nature and actually regulated globally. And so if you think about being strategic and thoughtful about the policy, about how you make this work, right? How do you make that transition work so that it doesn't necessarily, disrupt market, destroy markets to a certain extent? It's really a very tight rope that's being done. And so does the country do its own national policy? Does it work closely with regional partners to basically have a level playing field? These are central challenges which will really affect the P&L we talk about. So as a frame, things like decarbonization has a fundamental impact on the business. And what makes it even harder now is that unlike, jet fuel, which is priced to the market, everything is an offtake agreement. So whoever is first in the market to secure the biofuel actually gets the competitive advantage. And that's actually also a fundamental challenge, why Asian companies really have to also get in the game, because if not, the West will just basically lock in all the supply and feedstock in Southeast Asia. And that's a challenge we have.
So, it does seem that from the corporate perspective, we have Malaysia Airlines and Tenaga, and of course Khazanah as a shareholder investor. So that it is difficult to live up to your sustainability promises.
It's incredibly difficult. There's no illusion, right? Even if you were in IATA AGM Istanbul, leadership is split on whether or not the aviation industry can get to net zero. The interesting thing here is that we don't know what we don't know, right? What we know now is that everybody has to move to sustainable aviation fuels. And we as an airline, we modeled our technology roadmap. We see what aircraft are coming in, and we know very clearly we need to secure sustainable aviation fuel. That is my unique strategy as an airline that I need to take, right? The best pathway to net zero. It may not be the perfect one, and I'm pretty sure in 3 years it'll be wrong, because whatever comes through, whatever technology developments will change, right? So having the humility to know it's going to be a tough slog is actually the first pathway to actually getting stuff done.
So why do you come up with a sustainability framework and sustainability blueprint? Why do it at all? Let's just do BAU.
Well, it comes back to the first point. It fundamentally affects my theater of operations, right? That is a fundamental issue. And honestly, when I talk to my stakeholders, right, banks are asking me what's the status. My customers are asking what the status is, right? For Malaysia Airlines, we are a global operation. Only 1/3 of our customers are Malaysian. 2/3 of my customers are global in nature. And they're asking what is happening. Even in Europe, mandates on SAF are driven by corporate customers in Europe, right? So it is really a market-driven incentive when you think about it. And this is the challenge, right? Do you want European-based markets to set the tone for the global framework? That's the central challenge, right? So if you basically don't participate in the setting up of this framework, you're out of the game fundamentally.
Datuk, you picked up the mic.
Yeah, sorry. I just going to offer another perspective to what Philip just said, right? Fundamental to this is everything we do got trade-offs. Right? The problem with all of us, we want our cake and we want to eat it too. Right? As corporates, fundamentally to my earlier point, right? End of the day, it's all about profit and loss. It's all about dividends. As a company, because we are a corporate body, you're supposed to create returns, right? And to Philips, why, and you ask, so why bother with all this sustainability? Because that is what the customer is demanding. That is what the capital providers are demanding. You have to react to that, right? And to balance it out, to Shao Loong's point, well, we have to think about the unintended consequences. But end of the day, it's all about trade-offs. If, for example, we want Malaysia Airlines to be majority SAF, are we willing to pay higher ticket price? I think absolutely not. So how do we balance this, right? How do we then, companies react, try to give options and try to solve it, but end of the day, it's all about what the consumer wants or the customer wants. Right? And even for the energy industry also. I once was told there's a city in California that voted to have their energy supply to be 100% green, but then they voted and they said, yeah, we're willing to pay double the price. They voted for it. Here, a 1 cent increase in tariff, it will raise the roof. Right? Like, everybody will be uproar. But fundamental to all this is that something's got to give. There must be a trade-off somewhere. And there's a cost to everything. There's a cost to that transition. Right? So that is the actual fundamental challenge and perhaps underlying why whatever sustainable goals, we try to comply with because the capital providers are pushing for it, the customer are pushing for it. We try to balance in terms of the unintended consequences, the impact it will have. Right? So for example, for EV, everybody loves electric vehicles, almost everybody. But think about it, right? What's going to happen to the mechanics, the mechanics? Okay, we can easily say, and usually you see slides to say, oh, we can do upskilling, reskilling. Absolutely, but not 100%. There are some people who cannot be upskilled, who cannot be reskilled. So what do we do? Is it a question for corporate? Is it a question for government? Absolutely for government, but also corporate as responsible citizens need to think about that when you do that. But when we talk about EV, not a lot of things, not a lot of headlines are talking about, well, okay, what are we going to do, but those will be left behind, right? So that's something that I think we need to also think about when we think about why corporates are, hearing the call for sustainable goals, etc.
Shao Loong, maybe I need you to jump in at this point. I mean, of course, certainly we know, let's say, EVs or optimizing flight paths, etc. All these are sexy things to throw around when you're meeting up with your shareholder at the AGM, for example. Right? But based on what you're saying, are we doing the right things? Or yeah, certainly we're doing some of the right things, but are we doing enough of the right things?
Okay, good question. I would say I'm one of those people who doesn't love EV so much. What I would love more is public transport. You see, EV sounds good provided we stick to unsustainable patterns of consumption where we're all dependent upon private vehicles to get around. And, if we turned every car, internal combustion engine car in Malaysia right now into an EV, right, we would still have the same 1 hour, 2 hour jams stretching from Klang all the way to Ampang every day. That's not progress. It will be high technology progress, but not really progress in terms of quality of living. So for something like that, you've got to take a big systems approach. Right? And you got to look, we need to shift our modal share, now 80% private and only 20% public transport. We need to shift it to 50-50. That's the government target. But we need a plan on how to get there, right? We need quite a lot of plans, actually. And on that note, I've told the government the same thing, right? So Malaysia is a trading nation, right? That's one of our cliches. We trade a lot. We've got a really high trade to GDP ratio. Where's our main trading hub? Port Klang, right? What's going to happen to the commercial port in Port Klang in 80 years' time? It's going to be underwater because of sea level rise, right? That's one thing that doesn't turn back. You can stop your emissions. We can get global net zero, right? But to refreeze the glaciers and all that and refreeze the ice caps, it's going to take thousands of years. So the sea level is going to rise. Do we have a plan to deal with our trading hub going underwater? No. Do we have a plan to have a plan? No. So we need to take a bigger perspective. and look at some of the things that matter. Because if we lose our trading hub, then we lose a lot of economic opportunities as well.
Datuk and Philip, I think we need to get claps as well. No, but actually, good that you touched on water, Shao Loong. In fact, I think when we were putting together the agenda for today, we noticed, we thought that this was something important to talk about, and I think you'll see in the agenda that it's one of the panels that we've planned for this afternoon. Because water is I mean, not just the floods that we just experienced, but I think going forward, there's a lot more to think about and do in terms of water. But so this, I wanted to still on Shao Loong. I mean, definitely. There are some of the questions which are coming up is asking, should Malaysia now play a more leadership role? So it's not on this list now, but should Malaysia play a greater leadership role with regards to the developing nations in terms of speaking out against what I see as the Western hegemony?
I think we can, and we used to, actually. Malaysia used to be very active in the 1990s as a leading developing nation. We had a lot of fans amongst African countries who used to look to us for leadership and guidance. When I was very active about 20 years ago in international climate agreements, Malaysia was very well respected. We could walk into a room, we could lead negotiations, and we wouldn't be hoodwinked by the West, right? There was a lot of respect for us. Times have changed, of course, but and then there's a need for us to rebuild strength and also to rebuild presence in different international fora. So we can make better use of our presence in the United Nations. We can also be a bit more active in terms of protecting our trade agenda in the WTO against discriminatory measures as well. We have taken the EU there, along with Indonesia, over discrimination of palm oil, even though, frankly, our exports to the EU are not big, right? And even in terms of the worries about climate-related restrictions from Europe, only at most about 2 companies are affected by this, right? And even then, it's not a big portion of their trade. But the psychological shadow looms quite large. And at the same time, it's also important to send a signal that we will not tolerate discriminatory behavior on legitimate products. So I think having a greater international presence there is important. Just like, as Philip mentioned, actually, a lot of global business regulation gets set in international fora, right? ITO, International Telecommunications Union, and so forth. And these forums are usually set up by the developed countries because they took the technological lead in them. So it's quite important sometimes strategically pick and choose, of course, getting involved and getting presence and even a leadership presence in these organizations so that we have fair rules that reflect our needs as well there.
I feel like there's a clapometer at the back, or behind. Yeah, applause. No, it's good. But still on this international presence then, Datuk Amran, because earlier YB Nick Nazmi mentioned the reversal of the cross-border ban on RE. Well, how do you see that? Is this positive for Malaysia, or are we then, because I presume we generate a lot of renewable energy, so does it mean it's going to go out rather than coming in? Datuk?
I think if you don't have some sort of regulation on it, everything will go out. Because if you leave corporates to chase profit, then probably you can get higher revenue and profitability by exporting. But that doesn't serve the country. So even if we allow, and I think the government is trying to make Malaysia into an energy exchange, so in order to be an exchange, you have to have inflow and outflow. But you have to ensure that the generation of RE needs to be majority catering for local needs. Because it is an important competitive advantage for Malaysia. And that mechanism to balance between the how much you can export and how much you should retain must be there. and hopefully the government will come up with a more clear guideline on that.
Okay. Yeah, sure, Shao Loong.
If I can add on a bit as well, the minister earlier mentioned a report by the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA, the Malaysia Energy Transition Outlook. Now, that one takes a very ambitious scenario of moving to 90% or 100% renewable energy. That involves exports, renewable energy exports by Malaysia, but it also involves renewable energy imports from neighboring countries within an ASEAN grid. So in a way, we may be opening up at this stage, and that gives some additional export earnings potential for our local companies. But we also, in the future, can expect to import sources so that we can, decarbonize further as well. And not just for the Western countries' sake and our supply chains, but also for our own sake as well. Because, as Datuk Amran said, it's an energy security issue.
Okay, that's good. Maybe if I can move now to Philip. Certainly, I mean, we know that you're doing many things in this space, but how do you answer the question? How do you answer the question that could a lot of this be considered greenwashing? Especially, I suppose, when we're just dealing with public perception and compliance, as Datuk Amran was saying. So,
yeah, I think that's a really valid point, and that's why actually first thing is how you organize your sustainability function is very important. So, for example, for us in MEG, it doesn't sit in marketing, and even things like carbon trading and all that sit in the corporate treasury function, right? So how you organize yourself also reflects your intent when you project out there. So I think that's very important. Second thing is really you have to be very data-centric. So when we first came up with our blueprint, we didn't have any information. So what is your basis to take a certain action, right? So being very data-centric is very key. And actually some investment is needed there to really think about that. And when you start thinking about the cost of carbon and you start reflecting that cost of carbon in your investment decisions, whether it is about flight optimization tools or whether it's about making an investment between an EV versus a hydrocarbon-based ICE vehicle, you have to be data-centric for that. So I think that's very important. Fundamentally, I think with respect to greenwashing, what we do is we talk about the actions we take rather than the intent so much. So that I think is also very important when we talk about greenwashing. So really talking about the tangible actions you take. Maybe it's small, maybe it's not going to be earth-shattering, but you really have to talk about the action as opposed to the broad commitment.
Okay. So, I mean, it looks like it's quite a challenge for corporates going forward, but definitely I think there is some light. I see some light at the end of the tunnel. I just want to slowly bring this panel to a close. And I'm just seeing one question here from Philip on Slido. Can we, as a developing nation, group together against discriminatory Western policies? I think Yin Shao Loong has kind of touched on that. But this second part here, does it also increase inflation? And definitely, from what the panelists have said, yes, there is going to be trade-offs. Yes, there is going to be impact on company on the company's P&Ls, which will trickle down to consumers as well. So are we ready for this? But so with that in mind, can I just ask each of the panelists, maybe if you can just give your conclusions from what we've spoken about today, and also a takeaway message for our audience here, our clients here, as well as they continue with the rest of the conference today. Start with.
Okay, so just to recap on the climate and ESG stuff, right? You're being asked as firms to take action on climate issues, particularly to reduce the threat of climate change. And I pointed out a few big threats, including Port Klang turning into Atlantis, right? Now, when a European company cuts its emissions, Europe as a whole or the US as a whole cuts its emissions, that helps the whole world because their emissions are so big. Right? When a Malaysian company or Malaysia does the same, it doesn't do very much because our emissions are so small, less than 1%. Right? So bear that in mind. Bear the balance of risks. Understand your physical risks because they can be quite significant. Yeah? Petronas has even identified that 10% of their infrastructure is vulnerable to climate change. right? If you don't study, you don't know, and then it might be too late when disaster hits. So understand that climate is complex, it varies by geography, and it varies by history. And argue your case. Figure out what the story is for your company, and learn how to tell it. Thanks.
And let's not just dance the dance. Presume, right? Okay. Philip?
I think two things. Bringing Shao Loong's topic about, being in the global stage. I think we all here have a responsibility to also capacity build government to make sure that they can actually really also understand the technologies and challenges. I chair the Sustainable Aviation Task Force for the Ministry of Transport. I hope I don't need to chair it. I really hope Civil Aviation Authority chairs it, but it's part of capacity building. So all of us here have a responsibility to help government also capacity build. That's number one. Number two, we really have to collaborate together. We as an individual really cannot move the needle so much, but that collaboration must be extended within, to a certain extent, some of your competitors across your value chain and actually beyond your boundaries as well. So for example, on us, we work with Singapore to make sure that we have a clear sustainable aviation blueprint and drive that action for the region. So I think that's very important, right? Focusing on capacity building for the whole country, including your government, and actually driving collaboration across the board.
Yeah, I think I just want to end on back to as corporates, right? I mean, I see shareholders, I see management, etc. at room today. Management is hired to create returns for the shareholders and do good for the stakeholders. And as we go through this journey, being mindful of, again, the unintended consequences and not doing things not at our pace, etc., I think there needs to be a level of reasonableness in terms of expectation from shareholder and all the way up, if you're a GLC, all the way up to the MOF and government, right? Because as you go through this journey, like I said just now, you cannot have your cake and eat it too. Or unlikely. If you can, then very good. But unlikely. So as a shareholder, for example, we have to ask ourselves, are we able to stomach a drop in EBIT for the next 2-3 years because this company is going through that journey? As a management, you have to convince your board, convince your shareholder that this is good for the long term. I might get a dip in the short term, but if we don't do this, there will be a question on the survivability of the business model or the company. So this conversation needs to happen. And as long as all of us try our best and be reasonable in terms of our expectation of one another, then I think we can move forward together. And lastly, I think we always have to think about those that are left behind in this journey. And we do believe in Khazanah that as corporate bodies, we have to do our part as much as we can and not just rely on the policymakers and government to do it. Thank you.
Thanks for that. So maybe if I can just very quickly summarize everything that has been said here, and I know this is injustice in just in trying to do that, but certainly we agree, everyone here agrees that it's good to do good. We have to do our part. We have to be mindful of unintended consequences. But at the same time, in order for all of our actions to be effective, we must understand our risks, especially the physical risks. And of course, collaboration is key. And wherever we can, do help the government out. Gentlemen, is that fine? Okay, thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to hand over to our MC, Madam Khazanah. So, but with that, please help me to thank our panelists here for all their contributions and insights.